We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donation, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Rock Art Podcast, episode 48, with myself, the host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel. Today, we are interviewing an old friend, Albert Knight, who is a passionate advocate for Native Americans and the treasures of their cultural heritage, specifically with his efforts regarding rock art in Southern California. Well, hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and we're here at the Rock Art Podcast show. We have our guest scholar for this evening is a gentleman who I've known for most of my adult life. His name is Albert Knight, and Albert is an anthropologist, archaeologist, and a passionate advocate for Native people, and also someone who's rather sophisticated and knowledgeable about the subject of rock art. Albert Knight, are you with us?
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Well, it's really a pleasure. I guess we've been talking about doing this for maybe a little bit a while, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Now we finally have an opportunity to sort of...
You finally ran me down. I got tired of dodging, so here we go.
That's right, dodging. So, the opening question is always your interest in anthropology, archaeology, Native people, and the study of rock art was developed how, when, and where, and how did that emerge as a life's work for you? Because I know you're a professional who's employed in what's called the Cultural Resources Management Division expression, historic preservation and all. Think a bit about that and we'll chat. How's that?
Well, you had told me that was going to be one of the questions, and it caught me off guard because I'm an old man now, and I think some of my origins are lost in the mists of time and dying brain cells. So
how young are you, Al?
I'm 71, going on 70 something.
Okay,
so I'm in pretty good shape for my age, but so I'll say 71.
Isn't 71 the new 50?
Wrong side of 71, let's say. God, I hope so. 40. Come on, man. If you're going to
press
dream, let's make it 40,
So when did you
anyway.
So when did you begin?
I guess when I went to, reading National Geographic and Altamira and Lascaux, and I don't know exactly when the inflorescence of public awareness of Paleolithic European rock art was, in the late 50s for people that were hip, or certainly by the 60s, it was getting some press, that there were these cool cave paintings and places in Europe. So I suppose that's the first place I heard of rock art. And then I went to Los Angeles Valley College and took a bunch of anthropology classes there. And I'm sure the subject came up. But honestly, in terms of Southern California, I'm not sure, but I assume it was when I went to UCSB, Santa Barbara, and of course in 1965, Campbell Grant's beautiful Rock Art of the Chumash came out. So looking back, trying to answer your question, I assume at some point while I was in the anthropology department at UCSB, somebody waved the Grant book in front of my face, and I went, "Ooh, look at the pretty pictures."
I see.
And that I assume in terms of Southern California was probably first time I tuned into anything like that.
Did you go to school at UCSB? Did you have gain a degree there?
Oh yeah, I have my bachelor's from UCSB. I'm proud to say that in the same week, I got a letter throwing me out of the college for non-performance, and a letter saying I had graduated and I was on the dean's honor list. And I still had the dean's honor list thing. I wish I had kept the letter. It was like 1983 something saying,
"Oh wow."
Well, part of what had happened, like I said, I went to Valley College, got my AA, and my major was anthropology. Then I went into UCSB and I changed my major to something I thought I could make more money at, geology or geography or I don't even remember.
Yeah.
And so I was not the best student, so my grade point average went way down. And then I finally got the message. Somebody was like, "Change your major back, then all the good grades will kick in." My teacher, Mildred Whistler in Valley College, I think, gave me good grades because she liked me. And UCSB, you actually had to study. It was really inconvenient. So anyway, when I was in the geography department, my grade point average went way down. Then I switched back to anthropology, and all of a sudden it was like, boop, back into the black, so to speak.
Good. Did you get a bachelor's degree at UCSB, or did you?
In 1983, I got my bachelor's degree. Yes, I did.
And then did you go on for a graduate degree, or was that it?
I did not. Later, I took some several extension classes at UCLA. But no, when I was at UCSB, I had actually done a little restaurant work before I moved to Santa Barbara. So one of my friends had said, you should learn how to cook. The girls will like that. They really love it when their boyfriends can feed them. And also you'll be able to eat. You're not going to get paid squat. I used to call it smorgasbording.
Right.
The owner would say, "Hey, you're not supposed to be, hey, you're a cook. You're not supposed to be eating off of the smorgasbord." And I would say, "Oh, but I'm making sure the food is fresh. Let's see, this shrimp here. Yeah, that one's fresh. We can serve shrimp. And this piece of roast beef over here. Yeah, that's pretty tasty. We can serve that." And he was like, "Okay, fine, whatever, So, but the day came, I got my degree, as I said. And my girlfriend at the time, Pat, was in the anthropology department, and she actually paid attention to anthropology. And there were, if you recall back in those days, multiple large projects, fiber optic projects, oil line projects, Pacific gas and electric gas line projects, big infrastructure projects that needed a lot of people. And Pat came back to our apartment one day and she said, the people in the department say the All-American Pipeline is hiring archaeologists. All you have to do is be alive. They're so desperate for people, they'd even hire you, Al. And I was like, "Thank you, dear." And so I got hired on. UCSB had I don't remember what the program was called, but they actually did, they hired people out from UCSB to work on projects, Center for something studies, whatever it was called. So I was working for UCSB as a third-party subcontractor to the All-American Pipeline. Making money living in Santa Barbara. I was still in Isla Vista, but later we moved down to Santa Barbara near the harbor.
I see. And so where did you segue or transition from there?
Well, that I do remember because I still think of Santa Barbara. I'm not big on hiking, doing overnights, but I love day hikes. And I used to call Santa Barbara, the general county, the land of 1,000 day hikes, because there are so many pretty places to go, even without going around to the San Ynez Valley, Mission Creek and Gaviota Beach and so on and so forth. So at some point I had seen, when was the first really cool rock art site I saw? Painted Cave in Santa Barbara. Very accessible, of course. The road is right there. And so I was in my day hike mode in the anthropology department, doing restaurant work, oblivious other than in general to rock art. And again, probably because of the Campbell Grant book, and probably somebody mentioned it to me like, oh, you got to see Painted Cave. Wow. That was ka-ching, money in the bank. Like, okay, got to find out more about that. So and then it dawned on me doing the day hikes that the rock art sites were always in the prettiest place wherever you were. If you had 3 canyons up in the mountains and like San Marcos Pass is the most beautiful canyon, it's like, oh, the Indians had good taste, man. They're going to pick the prettiest spot, to have their ceremonies and such. So still in my day hike mode, I said, well, I can maximize my day hike pleasure by going to rock art sites. Mm-hmm. How do I figure out where those guys are? And you may recall there was a time there was no information center. I mean, we're here in California. I don't know who's listening to this, but there were other than the Berkeley Archaeological Survey, and I think the UCLA Archaeological Survey was kind of petering out by that time and starting to transition. And I don't remember all the names, but eventually became the pre-info center. Eventually it evolved into the info center. But anyway, some people in the department, especially John Johnson, who of course is now the curator of anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum, I had met him and he said, if you want to know where sites are, including rock art sites, and there's actually an archive here at the university where we keep all the paperwork we can get our hands on. Really? Okay. So I started out day hikes to rock art sites because I knew the rock art sites were at the prettiest places. And so I went to Indian Cave on West Camino Cielo, tried to find the rock art in Nahui Park, never did find it, still looking for it. It's back in under the Poison Oak somewhere, I guess. And a few other places, Naira, some start going into the backcountry sometimes. So I had the bug. That was it. I was like, okay, rock art, this is really cool. Here I am. I'm looking at rock art.
So then how did you transition into some sort of or did you some sort of a mainstream position with some sort of firm, or did you continue to freelance? And how did sort of rock art play back and forth? And how does that weave into your relationships with Native people?
Well, if you mean with my degree doing work versus purely looking at rock art, which really comes later, that's later in the story. I didn't really, when I was in Santa Barbara, I worked on the All-American Pipeline. There was the Central Coast Aqueduct project was a big project. There was a Union Oil pipeline over on the Hollister Coast. So I worked on various jobs, but while I was at the university, by the way, I went to UC Santa Barbara because I wanted to work on the Channel Islands. Like, I'm going to Santa Cruz Island. Still haven't been there. However many decades later it is. I did, so I was still doing restaurant work until, as I said, I was clued in about the All-American Pipeline. So that was, and the oil companies, whatever you want to say about them, pay fairly well compared to being a line cook. So I segued over, started doing archaeology, just monitoring, got into a little surveying, doing excavation work,
Who was what was the entity you were working for at that time?
Well, like I said, the All-American Pipeline was the university, the Center for Archaeological Studies or something like that. I don't.
So for UCSB itself.
At UCSB, yeah. Gotcha. And I think they only did 1 or 2 jobs after that. It got too political and too much hassle and too much logistics. And I remember we were doing All-American Pipeline back in Cuyama Valley and taking truck after truck, big old Ram SUVs of buckets of dirt from Cuyama Valley all the way back to UCSB to water screen it. Oh, wow. And we were doing that out of the anthropology building, and we plugged up, I guess eventually the maintenance came down on the anthropology department. Like, you've plugged up all the drains, the water's not flowing down, they're all full of sand and gravel and rock. And then if you screen stuff in the office, which was downstairs in the I don't remember the name of the building, but anyway, the building the anthropology department is in. You just opened the window. There were a couple particular windows that you opened, and there was some landscaping outside, and you just threw all your dirt when you were done with it out the window.
Out the window.
Yeah, and eventually the pile of dirt was up to the edge of the window, and again, maintenance said, "Well, you've buried several of our plants," and what do you think you're doing? You can't do that. So that was the end of the UCS, and plus whatever else was going on with the management issues and native. This was also at a time. See, when to jump ahead to talking about Native Americans, by that time, UCSB and some of the people in Santa Barbara had Native American monitors on pretty much any big job, even some of the little ones. Whereas that was, my understanding is really some of the work in the Santa Barbara area was some of the first places that monitors were really expected to be their Native American monitors. Mm-hmm. And later when I moved down to LA, it was like, oh, are we going to have a monitor or not? Or, oh, we'll hire some Cherokee that I met, at a party 2 weeks ago. He's a Native American. He counts and stuff like that. But in Santa Barbara, when I started out, I thought there were Native American monitors all over the place. And at that time, there weren't.
And what prompted you to move to Los Angeles?
Well, the big jobs kind of ran out. My parents were quite a bit older than I was. My father was 53 when I was born, and my mother was almost as old. So even though most of my contemporaries, their parents were still pretty viable, my parents were not in the best of health, and my father eventually passed away from Alzheimer's. So I was in Santa Barbara. The big jobs ran out. Money was short. Of course, Santa Barbara was very expensive even back then. And so between the economics of the thing and my parents needing help, my parents had a fairly decent house in North Hollywood where I had my own space. So I went back to LA partially to help my mother take care of my father, and partially because I was not making any money in Santa Barbara, certainly not enough to maintain myself at a decent level.
So then what happened in terms of your kind of affiliation with the anthropology, archaeology world? How did you make a living?
Well, I needed to work, and there were, again, this was the time there were, shopping centers were being built and roads were being widened and residential neighborhoods were being built. So there was plenty of work. And in Santa Barbara, as you know, Alan, the Chumash are high profile, beautiful art like the rock art, the baskets, the seagoing plank canoes, and I was like, God, man, everybody's studying the Chumash. Like, okay, it's interesting. I met people from San Ynez, still know some people out there at San Ynez back when they were as bad as dirt poor as you could be, way before the casino. So when I got back to LA, I had read a little bit of, like I said earlier, I took some extension classes at UCLA, and I discovered the Rock Art Archive. And one day I said to myself, okay, time for a day hike, Al, where are you going to go? And I thought, well, I'll go over to the Rock Art Archive and look up some rock art sites around here, in LA. Yeah. And so I did that and introduced myself. And I went one day, Alan, dang, man, everybody's chasing the Chumash stuff around. Nobody's paying any attention to rock art in LA, or almost no one. There were a couple, Linda King, Gregory Reinhardt, that studied the Four Horsemen site over in Santa Monica Mountains. But I was like, wow, hey, there's rock art in LA too. And with one or two exceptions, nobody's paying. Delmer Sandberg and Dana Blights had written something. But by and large, the field was wide open. I mean, quite literally.
Well, let me stop you right there. I know we've covered a lot of ground. And I think in the next segment, we'll continue this travelogue with our guest scholar, Albert Knight. See you on the flip-flop, gang.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Welcome back to the Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeology Podcast platform. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, with the California Rock Art Foundation, and we're blessed and graced to hear from our friend Albert Knight, who is sharing with us the developments which led to his career as a professional archaeologist, Native American advocate, and rock art scholar. Albert, in the first segment, we got to the Los Angeles platform, and that was about where we got to. So what happened next? The LA experience.
Well, two things, I guess, are pertinent. One's kind of a backwash to before I went to UCSB. I was raised in the San Fernando Valley, spent most of my life here, which is where I live now again. Before I went to UCSB, I used to hang out in the El Paso Mountains a lot.
Oh, my word.
That was before the 14 freeway was there. The first couple times I went, we'd have to take Sierra Highway all the way out. I was utterly oblivious to archaeology. And I do love the El Paso Mountains, which I know you are quite familiar with. So fast forward back to, okay, I've gone to UCSB. Now I'm back in LA.
Yeah, so we worked on the El Paso Mountains to identify it as a sacred site. And I believe that's one of the largest Native American sacred sites, probably in the United States. It's like 110,
I believe you told me that they turned it down because we asked for too much, but we can always trim it back.
No, that's we're fully accepted, and the Bureau of Land Management contacts me regularly about issues relating to the El Paso Mountains. So what we did together was good, quite amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, I had used to go out to the El Pasos quite a bit, moved to Santa Barbara, got used to the fog zone. That took a while. And then when I went back to LA, I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? I'll look at some rock art. Hey, I bet you there's rock art in the El Paso Mountains. If I was an Indian, that's where I'd hang out. So I determined, and again, by this time, I have introduced myself at the Rock Art Archive at UCLA. So I was determined to do some day hiking in the El Paso Mountains and see some new stuff. So I looked up some site records for the El Paso Mountains at UCLA and took off, did a couple trips out to the desert and said, I'm going to write a paper on the El Paso Mountains. And went back to LA and found somewhere, probably the Rock Art Archives, Linda King's article on Vasquez rocks. I have it on my desk right here, monograph number 20 from UCLA, Clem Meehan, editor. It also had a real nice article on the Four Horsemen site by Gregory Reinhardt. And so this was something new. This was rock art in Los Angeles, really close to where I live, within an hour drive. And I was like, wait a minute, what's that all about? I had been to Vasquez a few times. It's not real far from where I live, but I didn't know a thing about the rock art. So I went out to Vasquez, introduced myself to the rangers, very confident. Yes, I'm an archaeology guy, and I want to look at the rock art. And they said, no, not only can you not look at the rock art, you can't even go into that part of the park. You can't do that. You're not even supposed to know about it. Where did you find out about this? Who told you? And I was like, wait a minute. I haven't done anything wrong. What is the reticence? What's wrong with me? Because I want to know about the archaeology of the place. So anyway, I finally got to know the rangers that were there at the time. And of course, this would have been in the early 90s. And they very grudgingly told me, okay, we're going to let you into the rock art area, which is actually, there was a part of Vasquez Rocks is a wildlife reserve, LA County level. we're gonna allow you to go over there and look at stuff, but you can't tell nobody, and you never, ever can let our superiors in LA County Parks and Recs or anybody in LA County government know that we let you in. It's forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was nuts. Don't let the people that own and manage the resource know that you're interested in it or saw it. Very strange. Anyway, the Rangers allowed me access. And over the course of, since then, the early 1990s, eventually it came out. Al's out there taking pictures. We did a lot of site record supplements, found more rock art, found another 3 or 4 rock art sites that hadn't been recorded. I learned that if you want to see rock art, and it's still true today, if you want to find some rock art, what you do is you figure out where there is some rock art, and then you look at the surrounding area, and there's almost always more. So many things are, it's not quite as true as it used to be, but so many, especially rock art sites, are so under-recorded. The art hasn't been spotted in many cases, or especially when it's relatively minor. You know, if you have the Mona Lisa, it's a big deal, but you got all kinds of scratches and rubs and lines and minor stuff, little stickmen and all that. And that wasn't getting any attention at all, certainly at Vasquez Rocks. And then as I learned beyond that, so I determined, okay, well, I'm out there wandering around enjoying my day hikes. I'm going to take pictures and notes and fill out site records and keep a record and file it at the Rock Art Archive. So that's what I did. I kind of forgot about the El Paso Mountains.
Uh-huh.
And I believe I have told people that I decided I was going to instead write a paper on the rock art of LA County because, quote unquote, there's only 7 or 8 rock art sites in LA County. This won't take long, end quote.
That's remarkable. So from that particular perspective, what was your method or what was your strategy of continuing your study of the rock art of Los Angeles County?
Well, back to the Rock Art Archive. Now, recall we had talked about the information when I was at UCSB. The information centers, as we know them now, were still in the future. You know, there was a file, but it wasn't organized to the level that it is now. So I'm down at UCLA, taking extension classes, Rock Art Archive, and I learned about the UCLA Archaeological Survey, which I believe by that time was defunct, but there was something, and I don't remember what it was called, an office where they had the Archaeology Survey's files and they were collecting reports. And that's the ancestor of the Information Center, at least the one at UCLA. Mm-hmm. I'm not as familiar with the statewide system as a whole, but apparently this was happening at Berkeley and a couple of other places. What was it? The Bay Area, something in BARF, you know, the Bay Area Rock Art. I mean, It was a joke, and I'm glad people can joke about it, but it was a joke. It was, rock art was really an afterthought, and even archaeology in general, all the reports and work that was done and everything that was now being generated because of environmental impact statements and things like that, getting all that information together where people could draw on it, use it as a resource, was just really getting up and running in the way we know it now.
Sure.
So at some point, somebody told me about it wasn't the Archaeology Survey anymore again, but there was an office right around the hall from the Rock Art Archive where they kept all the records.
Right.
Well, actually, you know, now that I think about it, when I first tried doing a quote-unquote record search, it was still in Haynes Hall, and I think the Fowler Building was new at that time. Mm-hmm. And I think the Rock Art Archive, as long as I can remember, it's been in the Fowler. Okay. Although it's moved from one room to another, maybe two moves by now since I knew it. But I remember, I think John Parker was in charge, or Bruce Love, one of the two of them, was in charge of what became the Information Center. And it was in Haynes Hall, and only later moved to the Fowler. Well, so now we have let's call it the Information Center, a little premature, but will become the Information Center. And the Rock Art Archive both have paperwork on rock art sites, in the case of the Information Center, to be LA and Ventura counties and Orange counties. And the Rock Art Archive has whatever they have. So I asked the people at the Rock Art Archive, hey, have you ever gone around the corner or down the hall to the Information Center and copied the stuff they have on rock art? And the response was, "What's that?" The people in the Rock Art Archive were nice people. Clem Meehan started it way back when, but they were not archaeologists per se, other than Clem. Mm-hmm. He certainly knew the difference, but the people that were running the Rock Art Archive on a daily basis, Helen Michaelis was there back then, very, very nice old lady. That was news to her. She had no idea what an information center was. And I asked the same thing of the people at the information center. Hey, have you guys ever gone over to the Rock Art Archive and copied all the stuff that's pertinent to LA, Ventura, and Orange County? And they were like, "Oh, why would we do that? They don't have nothing." And I'm like, "Well, they have a little, but I mean, if they have nothing or only a little, I mean, it wouldn't be a lot of work to collate the two files, you know?" So I wound up doing that. I copied everything from the Rock Art Archive that was pertinent to the Information Center then at UCLA. This is the one that's been at Cal State Fullerton for about 20 years now.
So you began to synthesize the two archives.
Yeah, and so I got into the research aspect of, instead of just doing day hikes, like, wait a minute, what do we have here? I was doing it pretty much piecemeal on a case-by-case basis like Vasquez. And then one day, like I said, I'll write a paper on it. So I had to pay more attention to the, to information that I hadn't been that interested in. Also, in 1996, from my UCSB days, and I mentioned John Johnson earlier, I was elevated, if I may say that, to research associate at the anthropology department in Santa Barbara. And lo and behold, I had access to those files. Mm-hmm. And with my degree, I now had access to what was becoming the Information Center. And like I did for the El Paso Mountains, you went to Bakersfield, you still do. And UCSB had an Information Center, which just left last week, and went up to the museum, which I haven't seen yet. But now I had access to multiple sources of information and started to become more aware of the bigger picture. And so I got really interested in the interface between the Chumash country and LA in general. And that's kind of what I've not entirely concentrated on, but I'd go up to Owens Valley, something like that, and I like just looking at the rock art. I don't try to keep track of site numbers or site names. I mean, I get to a certain point, and it's not that my interest ends. I am interested in stuff further out, if you will, but I really tried to concentrate on the Ventura, LA, and maybe to some degree Kern County areas and become relatively expert in that core area.
So those have been your specializations, really, that whole... It's sort of a Southern California interface, isn't it?
South Central. Throw in San Luis Obispo maybe, and once in a while I hear about something. But I read everything, including by you, Alan, and anything I can get my hands on for Southern California and even beyond. But
your specialization seems to, consistently kind of turn on. Well, it's Los Angeles County, certainly. It's the San Fernando Valley, but it's also Kawayasu country with Kern.
Yeah, that's, and I finally did write that paper on the El Paso Mountains, as you know. I got to know Mark Fall, who was the state park ranger out at Red Rock Canyon. Mm-hmm. And we swapped a lot of war stories about when we used to camp out and party. He was probably the guy that told us to knock it off. But anyway, Mark was a resource ranger and state park ranger for a long time, and he was very knowledgeable about the history, or he's still around. So we co-authored a paper on the El Paso Mountains, finally did that. And of course, I met Andy Green and Harold Williams and some of the people out in the Tehachapi area, so had to start studying Tehachapi Mountains and the very southern Sierras. So but my core area, really, Santa Barbara, Ventura, LA, Kern, that's what I get excited about.
Yeah, that's your specialization. Well, we're almost through with this second segment. And I think in the next one, we're going to ask you to sort of drill down on maybe one or two of your favorite projects and those that you made some important discoveries. See you on the flip-flop, gang.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, with your Rock Art podcast. This is the third segment of episode 48. And we have a gentleman here who's spent much of his life, many decades, studying rock art in California. His name is Albert Knight. And I think in this last segment, we're going to drill down to some of his greatest discoveries, his interesting passions, and some of the wonderful elements of rock art treasures. Albert, are you there?
I am.
So you had mentioned that I think one of your more interesting and certainly from a variety of standpoints, important discoveries, or recognizing that there's a remarkable rock art site in the LA area, which may surprise people. So why don't you talk a bit about that saga?
The point I was at before was, I believe, just talking about going to the predecessors of the Information Center, the Santa Barbara Museum, the Rock Art Archive, et cetera, et cetera. So my first big discovery, if you will, which really wasn't a discovery. I mean, as you know, good research, what do we know already, or what do we think we know already? My first big discovery was, wow, there's a lot of this stuff out there. The stuff in this case being rock art, and let's say in the general Los Angeles County area, and overlapping into especially not so much Orange County. There's not a lot of rock art in Orange County, but southernmost Kern County, easternmost Ventura County, LA County, the area I was looking at. I went from 7 to 8. I think I'm somewhere in the vicinity now, 30 years later, 35 years later, whatever, 150. I don't know. It depends on whether you're a lumper or divider.
Yeah. Well, that's rather remarkable, and that's a testament to your indefatigable, efforts and knowledge and passion to recognize rock art.
I'm still a Chumash guy at heart, having gone to Santa Barbara and loving the beach and just that part of the world. And so I'm still a little Chumash centric, but now I'm in LA, and I'm looking at rock art in LA. I found out about Delmer Sandberg's work with Dana Blights and some other family members. Saw drawings and pictures of the Azusa Canyon site and some of the sites over in the desert, Big Rock Creek, Paiute Buttes. And I was like, okay, that's not Chumash rock art. That's definitely different. And but got over to Shays Castle in the Western Mojave Desert. And as I said a little earlier, mentioned Vasquez Rocks, and went, yeah, some of that rock art is pretty similar to Chumash rock art. Dana Blights had written a paper, and Bob Edberg had written papers long, long ago, fairly short, on distinctions between Chumash style art and Takic, let's call it for now, Takic language family art, like in Azusa Canyon in the desert. And so I started thinking, well, where does one end and the other begin? Is there an overlap, so on and so forth? So I started looking at a lot of rock art sites in the central part of LA County in the mountains, fair number of rock art sites in the desert north. Lo and behold, there's rock art in the San Fernando Valley. Wait a second, what's with that? So because, again, I spent much of my life in the San Fernando Valley, this whole idea, I mean, going back to my comment about Santa Barbara being the land of 1,000 day hikes and all that, I still kind of had it in my head, and I think most people do, that you got to go over there to find rock art. It's not here. It's not around the corner. You got to go somewhere. And that's true. If you live in central Orange County, there's not a lot of rock art. You got to go somewhere else. But the San Fernando Valley is surrounded by mountains. That's why it's a valley. Santa Monica Mountains. Bunch of rock art in the Santa Monica Mountains, the Four Horsemen sites, one of the best known ones. Simi Hills, and the West San Fernando Valley. Lots for people that know the Simi Hills. If you've ever seen the Lone Ranger, you've seen the Simi Hills. Very, very scenic rock outcrops, very weathered old seabeds, lots and lots of caves and rock shelters. So no surprise, lots of caves and rock shelters with fairly smooth faces. These are old sandstone formations. Guess what? There's rock art in the Simi Hills. One thing I didn't mention, but it's pertinent here, a lot of the rock art sites, say in the El Paso Mountains and even the Santa Monica Mountains, is on public lands. You need to deal with state parks, Tomocani and Tehachapi, for example. But the Four Horsemen site and the sites in the West San Fernando Valley were ka-ching on private property. Didn't have to fill out a bunch of forms. I mentioned the consternation of the Rangers at Vasquez a little bit earlier. Didn't have to go through the powers that be. Didn't have to explain myself. Just knock on somebody's door, if you know which door to knock on, and say, "Hi, I'm Al, and I'm interested in the Indian jazz." And people would go, "Oh, great. We want to know." I think I only had one property owner ever say, "You're not welcome." Most people would go, "Oh, yeah, we want to know more about that. Come on in, tell us what you know." And one of the sites in the West San Fernando Valley has paintings in the backyard, very nice polychrome Chumash style paintings. And I was talking to the property owner, the former property owner, somebody else owns it now. And the lady said, "Well, we always thought those were made by the Boy Scouts or something like that. How can you prove to me that those were actually made by Indians?" And I said, "Well, if you look down at your feet, you're standing on an arrowhead."
Oh, my word.
And after that, I was their buddy.
I'm sure.
They sold the property and somebody else came in, and we're on very good terms. So I can take people there periodically, including members of the local Indian community, and the property owners are very careful stewards of the property. They will let people come to see it with, reasonable arrangements ahead of time.
So before we get too far into it, there was a very remarkable site that had archaeoastronomical significance that I think has been recognized as one of the more premier or interesting sites in, I guess, the entire San Fernando Valley.
Well, yes. And the segue in here is the paintings in the backyard that the people own that I was just mentioning, the private parties, are a mini version of the place that you're talking about.
Really?
And that, of course, is Burro Flats.
Oh, my word. I didn't know.
Yes.
Okay.
I sometimes, depending on who I talk to, I call it Little Burro Flats.
Oh, wow.
It's really not, but the paintings are remarkably similar, and I invite you to come see them anytime you like. The people love having guests and
fantastic
hearing more about it.
Thank you.
In any case, in the taking extension classes at UCLA, I took a class from Dave Whitley, of course, a famous, well-regarded rock art researcher, and Edwin Krupp, who has been for a long, long time the director of Griffith Observatory in Griffith Park. So Dr. Krupp, we went, I think, to Sapotsky up in the Sierra Madre Ridge in the Santa Barbara backcountry the first time I met him, but the subject of Burro Flats came up. He said, "Oh, you live in the San Fernando Valley and you're interested in rock art. Have you ever seen the Burro Flats site?" And I said, "No, I've heard about it." But Burro Flats, for those that don't know, was a major research area, semi-military industrial complex where rocket engines were tested and where many nuclear reactors were built and tested back starting in the early 1950s and then continuing up until about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, let's say. So anyway, Dr. Krupp had access through John Romani, who I know you knew well, and other people, including Dan Larson, Gwen Romani, Charlie Cook, et cetera, And John had been a student at Cal State Northridge, and then by that time he was a graduate student, and then he was working in CRM, doing archaeological work on various sites. But he had got his way into what was called Rocketdyne at the time because of the rocket engine testing, and he was interested in not just enjoying wow, look how pretty it is, and wow, the Indians were really cool, painting beautiful stuff like this, but what is it about? Is it just nothing but decoration? And his response was, no, it's not an accurate comparison, and I will be chided for saying it, but it's a mini Stonehenge, if you will. It's a place where the Indians are marking the passage of time, and where they can tell how the seasons are progressing, and indeed how they can tell when the solstices, both the winter and the summer solstices, occur down to a day or two. And John was in this area. He wasn't the first person across the country or in Europe to start looking at rock art in those terms, but he was the first person I was really aware of that said, just looking at it and recording it isn't enough. We're obligated to try to figure out what's going on here. And of course, John was very good with Charlie Cook and Rudy Ortega and some of the other Native Americans, having them involved in his research from way when he started it back in the late 70s. So anyway, I went up to Burro Flats with Dr. Krupp and took one look at it, and that was it. I was hooked.
So what happened from there? I know that Ramani was one of the pioneers in the field of archaeoastronomy, and his master's thesis was, I know he discovered, I believe, some of those solstice alignments. Am I correct?
Yeah, of course. He discovered them, of course, in the sense that he was the one that went, oh, that's what it does.
Yes.
And I had done, we don't have time for it tonight, but I'm actually in contact with the last person that lived at Burro Flats before it became the research facility, the old ranching family. And I've done research beyond archaeoastronomy with the family and the history of the West Valley.
Wow.
And the first white people in the area knew the old Indian community, the Knapp family, who were really quite interesting. And Betty Knapp lived at Burro Flats, and her family, they were kind of caretakers of the canyon there for quite a long time. And I've got good evidence that the Native American community had access to those paintings until at least 1954, when the ranching families were forced out and the military industrial complex came in.
Took over, huh?
So anyway, I went a second time with Dr. Krupp to Burro Flats. Now I knew him a little bit better. Now I had met the people from NASA and the people that were, the property owners, as it were, government agency. NASA was not the original people up there doing testing, but by the time I was introduced to the area, you had to deal with NASA and Boeing. And so I said, Ed, you know what? I had the paperwork, had access to the Rock Art Archive, had information from the Information Center, Santa Barbara Museum, had all of John Romani's research, his various papers, which fortunately he was published. People were wise enough to publish so other people could see what he was talking about. So I said to Dr. Krupp, Ed, nobody has wandered outside of the core area since this thing was recorded. How about we come up here, just me and you, and maybe bring somebody to carry our briefcases, and we wander around and look for more stuff. And Ed said something like, well, can't do that, but I'll tell you what, you come on the next tour and I'll set it up so that you can lead the group and wander around and look for stuff while I lead the hike.
Fantastic.
And so Ed I went up, this is the second time. I told him that the first time. So second time I went up with a group tour with Ed, and they cut me loose. The people from NASA went, help yourself, go for a hike. So I found within the course of an hour, 3 more rock art sites, and maybe it was 4. No, it was 4. 4 more sites. 3 of them were rock art sites, and said, look, this core area, you remember my comment earlier, if you want to find rock art, you get find out where a rock art site is, and then you go look around the general area. Well, this is where that lesson was learned, when that in Vasquez Rocks. Within 15, 20 minutes, I'd found a couple more rock art sites.
How exciting.
Nothing nearly as spectacular as the Big Cave. I mean, there just isn't. The big famous cave is really wow. So then I went back a third time, Dr. Krupp, myself, and Dr. Gary Stickle, I believe.
Yes.
Stickle had been one of the people that originally helped record the site. And then we had a young guy, Richard Shepard, who was that I met at UCLA, was an artist. And we went and we recorded the 4 sites that I had found on that second tour.
Mm-hmm.
And then I gave the information to the information center, and they said, draw a circle around the whole thing. There were 11 sites recorded in the area, including the cave. I found 4 more. They said, draw a circle around the whole thing, and we'll give it a whole new site number. That's a complex. That's not just a bunch of disassociated sites. That's a big site with a very strong ceremonial, look at all this rock art and all these cupules and some of the few petroglyphs in that area and all that. So Fabulous. I got involved doing that, and then long pause, finished, went on my way, and came back years later. That's another whole story.
Well, we don't have much more time, but is there a closing statement or insight, reflection that you want to share with our audience about the nature of your adventure with rock art? What would you tell them? What should they know?
Okay, well, I will cite 3 cases very briefly, and I know you're familiar with the first one, Tomokani, which I worked, as you did, with the Tehachapi Heritage League and with the local Native American community, and we got a really beautiful major Indian village site with a bunch of rock art out of the Tehachapi area. Instead of it being developed and subdivided and roads being put in and all that, we got it made into a state historic park, which it is to this day. So historic preservation, going out and just looking at the stuff and saying, wow, and even finding stuff like John Romani, like, okay, what does it mean? That's all well and good, but we have a real obligation both to science, to ourselves, certainly to the Native American community to try to protect these places. Same thing happened at Vasquez Rocks. When I first went out there, as I said, I got the long look like, who are you? What? And over time, we don't have time to tell the story, but the county finally got the message. And the ranger in charge out there now has a degree in anthropology from Cal State Northridge, and she was born and raised in the area. And Sarah Brewer Thompson is now the chief ranger for not just Vasquez Rocks, but also for Placerita Canyon, Devil's Punch Bowl, et cetera, et cetera. We've gone from what's archaeology to actually having somebody with a degree managing the area, which is fabulous. And I'm now welcome and kissed when I come, by the way, instead of being booed. And then Burro Flats, I came back to Burro Flats to monitor on most people that have heard of Burro Flats and Rocketine are aware of these scare things about the radioactivity and all the pollution and all that. And it does have some issues, but it's basically bunk. I mean, the place is fabulous. There's all kinds of wildlife. There's no dead woods
Fantastic.
Or two-headed deer walking around. It's a fabulously beautiful place. And over the course of the last few years, myself and other people have been allowed to wander around further afield. And we now know that there are 25 places in the general Burro Flats area with rock art.
Well, that's about all the time we have, Al. I'd love to bring you back again and we can pick up where we left off. But this has been a fabulous romp into the rock art adventures. I'm
going to do a Rick Stevens and say my last comment is keep on traveling, keep on looking, because there's more to find.
Thank you, Albert. It's been an honor to have you on board. Thank you. See you next week, gang. See you in the flip-flop.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.